morning, welcome to Mrs. Mosaic Studios. Today I'm going to be showing you how to grout a small piece of work. To do grouting you're going to need some newspaper, a sponge, a small plastic box to mix your grout in, and I like to have something to just elevate the work so then it's easier to turn around on the newspaper so I can work around the whole thing. Now if you're working on a large scale piece you'd need to adjust your tools accordingly. So you would then apply the grout with something like this, which is a tile float. For a medium-sized project you'd use a squeegee. For most of the pieces that people do with me we end up using a sponge, and if you've done a class with me you'll have left with a small pot of powdered grout, a bowl, a stick to mix it with and a sponge. So that's how I'm going to be showing you how to do this today. Now when you're doing this I want you to allow about 45 minutes to an hour. Don't ever try and rush doing the grouting process. There's a lot of sitting around waiting for it to dry, but so you might want to have a cup of tea nearby, but you want to have a nice stretch of time to give yourself to complete this job. Got our grout colour here and it's in powder form. Got a nice little tub of it which if you've done one of my classes you'll have left with, and then you're just going to apply a little bit of water to the mixture. What you're looking to do is add a little bit at a time and then just gently stir it. I often say to people, if you have got a little bag that I've given you, keep a little bit of the powder back in the bag, and then if you've made your mixture too runny you can always add a little bit more powder further on. Very often I end up adding too much water. So we're just going to be gently stirring it. Now the description people have is that you mix it to a sponge cake consistency. I'm not really a great cook, so a very thick cream. It also depends on the colour grout that you're using. So I find the white grouts very often mix very smoothly, and things like the beige grouts, they've got like a sandier consistency to them, so they'll just feel differently when you're stirring them. Right, so I'm just going to give that a stir. I don't know if you can see this properly. You've got it nice and thick and nice smooth consistency. A lot of mosaicists then sort of leave it to stand for a few minutes. It just sort of helps the chemicals that are in that compound come together. We're going to apply this all over the mosaic, and what you're aiming to do is to push the grout into the gaps that are around the tiles. So if you can see there, we've pushed it all into those gaps. What you want to do then is just to work along the outside edge, creating a nice sort of darkened look and filling the perimeter, and that will make sure that part's weatherproof. So you can see I've got most of this coated now. Just got that one last edge that I'm going to go round with the palette knife. And then we're going to go in with the sponge, and I'll show you that in a second. Now what you might find is after this has been drying for sort of maybe 5 minutes, 10 minutes, you might look at it and think, oh hang on, I'm sure I put some grout there, and there's sort of a tiny little gap forming. Sometimes that's because it's actually sucked into an air pocket that might have been around your tiles or sort of underneath it, depending how many ridges are on the back of it. So pretty much I've coated that now, all in the grout. Here's a sponge. If you've got one of my packs you would have got one of these in it. I always use the spongy side of the sponge at this stage. This will make more sense as it starts to dry where we use the other part of the sponge. So now I'm taking the sponge and I'm wiping the grout across the surface, and as you can see the tiles are now becoming a lot more visible. So once you've got that wiped back to this sort of stage, that's where you're going to be leaving it to dry. I would say today's quite a cold day, we're going to allow at least 20 minutes before we actually touch it. So what you're looking for is for a cloudy consistency to come across some of those tiles before we start wiping it away a bit more. So we'll leave that about 20 minutes, 25 minutes, and we'll see where we're at. Right, so we've left it about 20 minutes, 25 minutes. We've come back to the piece. It's quite a cold day in my studio today, so it hasn't dried as quickly as I thought. So we're going to give it another 20 minutes. But what I do want to show you is, as this has got different levels, and very often my mosaic students have different heights with their tiles, the ones that are higher have started to dry quicker. So we can give that a little bit of work. And it's at this stage, as it's been drying for a while, you can wipe back a little bit more. You've just got to be really careful that in the act of wiping it back, it's quite soothing and comforting to do, that you don't get too engrossed and you start pulling out the grout between the tiles. So a wipe over is absolutely fine, and we'll come back in another 10 minutes. Right, so it's been about 45 minutes to an hour, this one. We've got very small gaps here, and the space in between it's quite higgledy-piggledy, so that's why it's taken a bit longer. But you can see the outside ones are coming up really nice and shiny now. So there's a few different ways you can approach this. I've got some newspaper to take up sort of the dampness from the pieces in the middle here. But at this stage you can also start using the white scoury side of your sponge. If you haven't got one of these kits from me, or you've left a class with something and you're going to use your own sponges, don't use the green sponges, because if it's got the scratchy scoury side and it's green and you're using white grout, it will bleed into it and then your grout might turn a funny shade of green, and you don't really want that. So I like to use these non-stick scoury sides, and that takes the excess off of the tiles. So just a gentle agitation of the surface, I think we'd call that. We'll bring that up, and we're in the final stages. If your grout is now solid, as mine is, if you've put sticks through it to have holders after, now's the time to take them out. And then you'll have your holes already pre-formed to put your wire through when it's dry. Right, so we're on the final stage really now. You can see we've got it wiped back pretty well. There's a few areas where it's actually where glue has got on top of the tiles. Can you see here? So you just don't ever use metal, just use some wood, and you can then bring that back and push that bit of glue off the surface. But no, we're pretty close here really. So give that a good clean down. You can spend all afternoon wiping it back. It's knowing when to stop really, but I think this is a suitable situation. And that's the finished mosaic. And then I'd leave it 24 hours, keep it flat for 24 hours, and then you can just give it a buff over with some glass spray or some white vinegar and a soft cloth, and it'll bring it up really sparkly.